I don't know if there's a church anywhere that does this, and I'm not suggesting that we start doing this here, but imagine. Imagine how our worship might be a little bit different if when Father Ken got up and read the reading today from Matthew chapter 14, he started with chapter 1, verse 1, and then just kept going till we got to the feeding of the 5,000. What would that be like? It would only take about 30 minutes more. I mean, we've all got time, right? What would that be like? I think hearing the story leading up to that moment would change how we hear the feeding of the 5,000. Because the feeding is more than a miracle, and it's more than a story encouraging us to share what we have with those who are in need. What difference would hearing the bigger story make? I would give you an example from the Odyssey, because I saw it this week and it's still fresh in my mind, but I don't dare risk giving any spoilers for the Odyssey. So I'll stick to television. If you hear Ross Geller say, "We were on a break," sometime in the 9th season of Friends, that line may or may not be funny, but I bet it hits differently if you've been watching Friends since the beginning. Or if you hear Sheldon sing "Soft Kitty" in the final season of The Big Bang Theory. That's always going to be entertaining, at least to me. But it's even better when you realize the backstory of that. Or if, I don't know, if you see a guy string a bow and then twang the bowstring, I'm just saying, that might be more meaningful if you remember everything that led up to that moment. Well, I think Matthew very much wants us to hear the feeding of the 5,000, not on its own, not as an isolated chunk from the midpoint of his gospel. No, Matthew wants us to hear the feeding as part of God's bigger story. Matthew says, "Now when Jesus heard this, he withdrew from there in a boat to a deserted place by himself." When Jesus heard this, what did Jesus hear? Jesus has just heard that John the Baptist has been killed. John is dead, killed by the command of Herod Antipas, the ruler and wannabe king of Galilee. John's disciples come, they take his body, they bury it, and then they go and they tell Jesus that John is dead. And when Jesus hears that, he needs a moment. Matthew says Jesus withdrew from there in a boat to a deserted place by himself. A deserted place is what Matthew says, not a desert. There aren't any deserts in that part of Israel up in the northwest corner of the Sea of Galilee. Some translations prefer to say that Jesus went to a lonely place. What Matthew probably means is a spot along the shoreline near Capernaum, but one that's not as populated. There are a lot of those. Maybe Jesus went to a place that looks a little bit like this. Yeah. So this is a picture I took 3 years ago in Israel, near the place that the tour guides will tell you is where Jesus fed the 5,000. It's very, very peaceful. Wherever this deserted place is, Jesus goes there by boat. Now, Jesus is the only one in the boat, but he's not alone. Matthew says that crowds see Jesus out there in the boat, and they follow him on foot. And I have some questions about this. If Jesus needs a moment and just wants to get away by himself, why doesn't he just stay out there in the boat, alone, on the water? And what makes Jesus go by boat in the first place? He clearly knows where he's going, and he could have gone there on foot because that's what the crowds do. So what's the point of going there by boat? I think Jesus needs a moment. I think he wants to go away for a bit, but he also wants to be in a deserted place near some water to remind him of John, to remember the days when John was preaching in the wilderness of Judea, another deserted place, and when John was baptizing people in the waters of the Jordan River, a time before the testing, before the calling of the 12, before hearing the hard news that John is dead. So Jesus goes to this deserted place along the shore of the Sea of Galilee. He gets out of the boat and he sees the large crowd that has followed him there on foot. And then Matthew says this: Jesus has compassion on the crowd. If that phrase sounds familiar, there's a reason why. We heard it right here earlier this summer, just a couple weeks ago, when Father Drew preached on a story from Matthew chapter 9. In chapter 9, Matthew says that Jesus was teaching and preaching and healing. And when Jesus saw the crowds, Matthew says, he had compassion on them. And in that earlier story, Matthew also tells us why Jesus had compassion on them. Matthew says in chapter 9 that Jesus had compassion on the crowd because they were like sheep without a shepherd. That's what Matthew says in chapter 9. Matthew does not say that here in chapter 14. And the reason why is this: now the crowd is no longer like a flock that has no shepherd. Now the flock has a shepherd. It's not John. It's certainly not Herod. It's Jesus. For many, many years, since at least the time of David, that shepherd who became a king, calling someone shepherd is one way to describe someone who's a leader of the people. Now, Matthew begins his gospel, very first verse, by telling us that Jesus is a son of David. But as Matthew continues his story, he shows us what it means, what it really means to say that Jesus is a son of David, because he is. As we read Matthew's gospel, we see that Jesus is a son of David. He is a king. He is a shepherd. But Jesus is not a leader like Herod. And Jesus is not another John the Baptist. Jesus is a shepherd. And Jesus does what shepherds do. Matthew doesn't tell us this. Matthew shows us. Matthew shows Jesus feeding the sheep of his flock. He has them lie down on the grass, and he feeds them, all of them, from the youngest to the oldest. All of them, more than 5,000. Jesus feeds them, and Matthew says they are filled. They are satisfied. Now, Matthew loves to quote in his gospel all those Old Testament scriptures that Jesus has fulfilled in his ministry. But here, Matthew shows us Jesus feeding the 5,000, and he does it without quoting any verses. Verses like Isaiah 40:11, which says, "He will feed his flock like a shepherd." If hearing that verse, Isaiah 40:11, makes you think of Jesus, it might be because you know Handel's Messiah really well. I'm not going to sing it for you. Handel was not the first person to apply Isaiah 40:11 to Jesus, but no one in the New Testament quotes it. But I like to imagine that Matthew keeps hearing that verse. He will feed his flock like a shepherd. Matthew keeps hearing that verse over and over in his mind as he tells us the story of the 5,000. The feeding is more than a miracle. It's more than a story encouraging us to share what we have with those who are in need. The feeding of the 5,000 is part of a much bigger story. The feeding of the 5,000 gives us a glimpse of who God is. And this story helps us say, with all the saints who have gone before us, "The Lord is my shepherd. I shall not be in want. And this is good news. Amen.